There are storms that sweep across open plains, storms that tear through towns and leave nothing but splinters behind. But the storms that truly break a man aren't made of wind or rain, they're made of debts unpaid, promises broken, and hope that slips through your fingers like grains of sand. This town knew such a storm intimately, felt it every morning as they woke beneath dark skies heavy with worry, every evening as the lights went out, wondering if tomorrow would come easier. In the bitter heart of winter, beneath a flickering street lamp, a lone figure huddles against a fence, lost, hunted, eyes wide with secrets she can't escape. Across the road, a man stands weary but resolute, shoulders heavy under the weight of loss and uncertainty. Tonight, their paths cross beneath the cold fury of snowfall. Tonight, Editate lives built carefully from scraps and grit, hang by the thinnest thread. This is a place where debts come due and past refuse to stay buried. And tonight, the storm they've been running from is finally at their door. Thomas Faulkner was 52 years old, with faint lines etched into the corners of his eyes and the resolute posture of a man who had seen more hardship than comfort. He woke every morning in the cramped apartment above his auto repair shop, tucked into a corner lot on the outskirts of Silverton, a small American town that felt forgotten by time. Even before dawn, he would shuffle downstairs, greet the battered garage doors with a quiet nod, and flip the switch that illuminated a space filled with decades' worth of tools, spare parts, and memories. The place, known simply as Faulkner's Repairs, was a labor of love passed down from his father, an inheritance of grease-stained floors and an aging clientele that had diminished as the younger population moved on to bigger cities. Thomas had served in the military as a mechanic, traveling around the world before settling here, determined to honor his father's legacy by keeping the shop running. Yet times were hard. The landlord had raised the rent again. Business was slow, and small towns no longer provided enough customers to cover the bills. His 10-year-old son, Ethan, was the sole light that kept Thomas pushing through the day. The boy's boundless curiosity and bright eyes reminded him of a life that still held promise. Ethan was an imaginative child, spending hours tinkering with broken radios or old bicycle chains, absorbing every bit of mechanical knowledge his father could teach him. Thomas tried his best to shield Ethan from the looming financial anxieties, eviction notices, phone calls from creditors, and the persistent fear of losing the only home and workplace they had. But Ethan was perceptive. He saw the lines in his father's face deepen with each passing week and heard the late-night pacing above the creaking floors. Still, father and son maintained a ritual dinner together at a wobbly kitchen table where Thomas would listen to Ethan recount his day at school, the science projects, the new contraption he wanted to build, and the friends he was making. These moments were a small refuge from the unrelenting worries stacking up like unpaid invoices on the office desk. Thomas never complained aloud, never openly grieved the death of his wife, Helena, 4 years prior, though the emptiness she left behind was an ache he carried with him wherever he went. Her photograph still hung in the stairwell, capturing a time when laughter and hope had filled every corner of their lives. Winter had rolled into Silverton early this year, the temperatures plummeting and the wind gusts rattling the steel siding of Faulkner's Repairs. Snow piled along the edges of the parking lot, and frost rimmed the garage windows each morning. On a particularly frigid evening, Thomas was shutting off the overhead lights and preparing to close up shop when he glanced outside at the swirling flakes illuminated by a lone street lamp. It was a night so cold the wind seemed to cut right through a person's bones. In that fleeting moment, he thought he saw a shape shift in the darkness near the fence. A person, perhaps. Thomas paused, heart pounding, mind torn between ignoring what could be a wandering stray cat and stepping into that piercing cold to investigate. A sense of duty, born from his military days and the lessons of his father, tugged at him. He sighed, pulled on his jacket, and moved toward the garage door, bracing himself against the icy gusts. Unaware that this single act of kindness would upend everything he thought he knew about family, duty, and what truly mattered in life. Stepping out into the biting cold, Thomas squinted to see through the swirling snow. A distant lamp cast a shaky yellow glow, illuminating what looked like a slender figure huddled against the chain-link fence. At first, He couldn't tell if it was a teenager or just an adult with a slight frame, only that whoever it was seemed to be wearing clothes too thin for this punishing weather. The person was crouched low, knees drawn to their chest, hair half plastered to their forehead by melting snow. Thomas's instincts flared out here, in the middle of nowhere with the temperature dropping into the teens. No one should be left alone. He moved slowly, raising his arms in a gesture of peace. "You okay there?" he called out, the wind nearly swallowing his words. The figure didn't respond. Drawing closer, he finally saw that it was a young woman, maybe 18 or 19. Her cheeks were flushed red from the cold, lips chapped, and her breathing shallow. She looked up at him, eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and fear, as though she were ready to bolt at any second. "My name's Thomas," he said gently, stopping a few feet away. "I've got a warm place right inside. Not fancy, but it's heated, and I can give you some food." She seemed to consider his words, glancing at the garage behind him. Then, after a tense silence, she gave the slightest nod. Thomas shrugged off his jacket and offered it to her, though she hesitated before accepting it. Her fingers trembled as she wrapped the too big coat around herself. Inside the shop, the overhead lights buzzed softly against the hush of the storm outside. Thomas closed the garage door, sealing out the worst of the cold, then guided her toward a modest office area in the back. A battered couch, a small electric heater, and an old coffee machine sat in the corner. The woman sank into the couch, eyes darting around as if she expected trouble. Thomas rummaged in a cabinet and pulled out a can of soup, setting a saucepan on a portable burner. He kept his movements calm, methodical. While the soup warmed, she pressed her hands close to the heater's orange coils, trying to thaw them. Thomas handed her a clean towel, and she dabbed at her wet hair. Finally, he offered her a mug of tea, steam curling in the cold air. "Here," he said softly. She cradled it, nodding her thanks without meeting his gaze. In the brighter light, Thomas noted details. Her nails were clean and manicured, in stark contrast to her threadbare jacket and scuffed boots. A delicate bracelet glinted at her wrist, something that seemed oddly expensive for someone in such a state. He frowned, curiosity growing, but he didn't pry. If she wanted to tell him, she would in her own time. "Want to tell me your name?" he asked eventually, stirring the soup slowly. She paused, tension flickering across her features. Then she said simply, "Eliza." It could have been a lie, but it was something. Thomas nodded, offering her the steaming soup. As she took the bowl, her fingers shook so visibly that a bit of broth sloshed over the side. He placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying it. "Easy," he murmured. "You're safe here." Though her eyes still held shadows of mistrust, something in his tone must have comforted her, because she nodded and whispered, "Thank you," the first real words she had spoken since she arrived. After a few hours, the storm intensified, the wind roaring as if it were trying to tear the old shop off its foundations. Thomas set up a makeshift cot for Eliza in the corner of the office space. Layering blankets until the mound of fabric was almost comically high, she sank into the blankets with the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept in days. Thomas watched for a moment, ensuring she was comfortable, then switched off the main light, leaving only a small desk lamp aglow. He ascended the narrow staircase to the apartment above the garage, where Ethan would be waiting. The boy typically got anxious when his father was late, though he tried to hide it behind a wall of calm maturity that few 10-year-olds possessed. Sure enough, as soon as Thomas opened the apartment door, he found Ethan curled up on the sofa, reading a worn science magazine by lamplight, eyelids heavy with fatigue. "You stayed up again," Thomas said softly, removing his boots at the threshold. Ethan shrugged. "Wanted to make sure you were okay. The wind's so loud tonight." Thomas nodded, sinking onto the couch beside him. He ruffled the boy's hair, offering a reassuring smile. Despite the warmth of the room, Thomas still felt a chill in his bones from being outside. He hesitated, then told Ethan about the young woman downstairs, though he kept the details vague. "She was out in the storm," he explained. "Couldn't just leave her there." Ethan's eyes flickered with curiosity. "Is she homeless?" he asked bluntly, as children often do. Thomas leaned back, unsure how to answer. Might be, he said. I'm not sure. The truth was, he didn't know anything about her, only that she seemed genuinely frightened and entirely unprepared for the harsh conditions. It struck him how easy it was to make assumptions. She might be homeless or a runaway, or maybe she was something else entirely, someone from a different world, caught in a circumstance she hadn't anticipated. Thomas got up and prepared a quick dinner of scrambled eggs and toast for Ethan, who ate gratefully while repeating all the exciting details of a science project he'd started at school. The boy spoke about electromagnets and circuits, demonstrating how a simple coil of wire around a nail could pick up paper clips if attached to a battery. Thomas listened, half distracted by thoughts of Eliza below. He remembered the fear in her eyes when he first approached. It was the kind of fear one sees in people running from something or someone. He had seen similar expressions during his military service, when local children or frightened refugees would glance at him warily. It was a look that said trusting anyone could be a fatal mistake. He wondered what might have happened to her to place her in this precarious state. Finally, after Ethan had drifted off to sleep, Thomas himself lay awake in bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling. The wind howled, rattling the windows, but his thoughts returned again and again to the young woman he had found in the snow. He knew tomorrow would bring questions both from Ethan and from himself. Yet a part of him sensed that whatever answers came, they would alter the path he and his son were on, whether he wanted them to or not. The next morning brought a dull gray light through the garage windows, accompanied by the steady drip of melting snow outside. The storm had subsided, but it left behind colossal drifts and patches of ice glistening along the road. Thomas woke early to the muffled noises of movement downstairs. At first, he panicked that someone had broken in. Then he remembered Eliza. Slipping quietly into the shop, he found her hunched over the portable burner, trying to heat water for coffee. She was wearing the same thin coat, minus his jacket, which was now draped over a chair to dry. Her face showed more color than it had the night before, and though her eyes remained guarded, she greeted him with a tentative nod. "Morning," Thomas said, forcing a small smile. He reached past her to adjust the burner's temperature, more out of habit than condescension. "This thing's finicky," he explained. "Mind if I help?" Eliza stepped aside, allowing him to take over. She folded her arms protectively across her chest, watching as he set out two chipped mugs and scooped instant coffee into them. They shared the coffee in silence for a few minutes, the bitter warmth stirring them to full wakefulness. The shop smelled of motor oil, stale coffee, and damp clothing, but it was a familiar scent to Thomas, one that spoke of endurance. Eliza sipped slowly, occasionally glancing around. She seemed to be calculating every detail, as though memorizing an escape route. "You staying put for a bit?" he asked finally, breaking the tension. She shrugged, eyes lowered. "I don't have anywhere else right now." Her voice was soft, carrying the weight of the unspoken history. Thomas cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "I'm not a charity, but you're welcome to stay. There's a couch upstairs that might be a bit more comfortable." He paused, wondering if he was overstepping. "My son, Ethan, he'll be down soon. Just don't want you to be startled by a 10-year-old boy bounding around." Her lips twitched slightly, almost a smile. "Thanks," she murmured. Before long, Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, rubbing sleep from his eyes and peering curiously at Eliza. He didn't say anything at first, just offered a small wave, which she returned hesitantly. Thomas busied himself with opening the garage door, letting in a cold gust of morning air that made everyone shiver, but also cleared out the stale smell of the night. He scrawled a "be right back" note and stuck it on the counter, then told Eliza and Ethan to stay inside while he ran to the small market a few blocks away to grab some breakfast essentials. It was a short drive, but it gave Thomas time to process. He replayed the conversation with Eliza, noticing every hesitation. No mention of family, no mention of a final destination. She was in limbo, like a lost traveler who missed her stop. For some reason, he felt protective of her, even though they were strangers. Maybe it was the paternal instinct that had grown stronger since his wife's passing, Or perhaps it was the memory of certain nights overseas when he'd encountered desperate souls in need of shelter. Regardless, he resolved to handle this with patience, let her speak on her own terms, give her space if she wanted it, and keep an eye on Ethan in case anything seemed off. Yet deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that Eliza was more than just a runaway in need of warmth. The routine of the repair shop offered a comforting rhythm to the day. Once Thomas returned with fresh bread, eggs, and some canned fruit, he made breakfast upstairs. While Ethan devoured scrambled eggs, Eliza sat quietly at the table, slowly chewing on a slice of toast. She observed every corner of the apartment, the peeling wallpaper, the framed photographs of Thomas's late father in front of the shop, and a faded picture of Thomas in uniform, standing next to a woman with gentle eyes, his wife. Ethan, never one to remain quiet for long, eventually started peppering Eliza with questions. Where are you from? Did you come by train or bus? Do you like science? His 10-year-old curiosity overflowed. Thomas tried to intervene, muttering a soft, "Ethan, give her some space." But Eliza surprised them both by answering in short, polite bursts. She said she liked astronomy, that she'd traveled by bus from the east, and offered no mention of her hometown. When Ethan asked why she was traveling alone, her mouth formed a tight line. She simply responded, needed a change. Thomas sensed the unease in her posture and steered the conversation towards simpler topics, favorite foods, whether they'd seen the latest big meteor shower, the normal small talk that anchors people in shared humanity. Gradually, the tension in her shoulders eased. By noon, they all headed downstairs to open the shop, and Ethan took his usual spot near the tool bench, tinkering with an old radio. Eliza hovered nearby, as though uncertain where she fit in this unexpected routine. "Want to help me inventory some parts?" Thomas offered, pulling out a clipboard. She looked surprised but nodded. They moved together through the shop, counting spark plugs, fan belts, and filters. Thomas noticed Eliza's brows knit in concentration, her lips moving slightly as she kept mental tallies. Occasionally, she'd pause to ask a question, pointing to an engine part she didn't recognize. Her quiet curiosity reminded him of Ethan when he was younger, equally inquisitive but more guarded, as if she feared revealing too much of herself. Throughout the afternoon, a couple of customers trickled in. One was Mr. Alderman, a retiree who brought his sedan in for an oil change. Eliza slipped away to the back as soon as she heard voices, as though desperate to remain invisible. Thomas handled the transactions, forcing a smile as he assured Mr. Alderman that everything was under control and the shop wasn't going under anytime soon. In truth, the rent was past due, and the last thing Thomas needed was more tension, but he maintained his stoic composure. Meanwhile, Ethan took it upon himself to bring Eliza a warm soda from the vending machine in the corner, offering it like an olive branch. The simple gesture, unremarkable in many settings, carried weight here. She thanked him so softly Thomas almost didn't catch it. He saw in Ethan's bright eyes that the boy was already forming a bond, an empathy for this mysterious young woman who had stumbled into their lives. Thomas wondered if he should caution Ethan not to get too attached, but something stopped him, perhaps a father's sense that this connection was important for them all, that maybe Eliza needed the unconditional kindness only a child could give. Later in the afternoon, a biting wind picked up again, rustling the old corrugated metal roof of the garage and signaling another wave of cold. Thomas stood at the workbench, elbows resting on the scarred wood surface, calculating the latest numbers from his ledger. The margins were grim. Costs of parts had risen, while the number of paying customers dwindled. He felt the weight of each overdue bill like stones in his pocket. If something didn't change soon, Faulkner's repairs would be shuttered, just another relic of the past in a dying town. He heard footsteps approaching and lifted his gaze. Eliza hovered near the edge of the bench. Her cheeks were slightly flushed, and she fiddled with the silver bracelet on her wrist, one of the few signs of elegance she had, which still puzzled him. "Need something?" he asked, trying not to sound abrupt. She hesitated, glancing at the clipboard full of numbers. "You look stressed," she said softly, which took him by surprise. Her eyes flicked to the ledger. "That's the shop's finances." Thomas stiffened. "Yeah, but It's my responsibility. Don't worry about it. He realized how cold that sounded and forced a gentler tone. I'll figure it out. She nodded, seeming to sense his pride. I'm sorry, she murmured, stepping back as if she had overstepped a boundary. If I can help with anything. She let the offer trail off. Thomas studied her for a moment, torn between curiosity and caution. He knew nothing about this woman except her name, if that even was her real name, and that she had found herself in dire straits. Yet, there was a sincerity in her concern that made him want to trust her. He cleared his throat. You ever do budgeting or inventory before? A wry smile touched his lips. Not exactly glamorous work. She gave a small shrug. No, but I can learn. I'm good with numbers. Nodding, he gestured for her to come closer. Side by side, they pored over the ledger as he explained costs, revenue, and the precarious gap between the two. She asked pointed questions about supply rates and overhead. Thomas was taken aback by how quickly she understood the problem. She suggested a few ways he might negotiate lower part prices or offer small promotions to draw in more clients. Simple ideas that, in the swirl of daily stress, he hadn't fully considered. At one point, Ethan skipped into the room, brandishing a rusted gear he'd found behind an old shelf, and asked if it was from a tractor. Thomas barely had time to respond before Eliza smiled and said, "Looks more like a timing gear from a vintage truck." Ethan's jaw dropped, and he rushed forward to see if she was right. "That's a good eye," Thomas acknowledged, impressed. Eliza offered a modest nod, her lips curving in an unspoken thanks. For a brief moment, the three of them stood in close proximity, the cold wind rattling the building outside. While inside, they formed a pocket of warmth and cooperation. Thomas couldn't recall the last time he'd felt this sense of camaraderie, especially with a stranger. It was as though a crack of light had appeared in the storm clouds that hung over Faulkner's repairs. The next few days fell into a tentative routine. Eliza slept on the upstairs couch at night and spent most of her daylight hours in the garage helping out, though. Helping meant she often stood quietly at first, observing, occasionally assisting Ethan in cleaning or organizing tools. Bit by bit, she gained confidence. She asked Thomas how carburetors worked, how to check for a faulty alternator, and how to patch a leaky tire. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty, which Thomas admired. More than that, she had a knack for memorizing part numbers, offering them to him without hesitation when customers came looking for a specific belt or filter. Ethan, overjoyed at having someone new around, showed her everything: the row of toy cars he'd collected, the model rocket he was building, and even the old picture albums he'd found in a dusty trunk, photos of the shop's early days when Thomas's father was in charge. One evening, Eliza lingered in the back office, flipping through those old photos, her expression unreadable. Thomas found her there, gazing at a yellowed image of a younger Thomas wearing his military uniform, standing beside a woman with laughter in her eyes. "That's my wife," he said quietly, stepping closer. "Angela." The name caught in his throat, a reminder of the life he once had. Eliza glanced at him, sympathy evident, but said nothing. The silence held weight, like a moment of shared understanding. He had lost someone, and perhaps Eliza had lost something too, though not necessarily a person, maybe a life, a sense of home. Each day, Thomas waited for her to open up about her past, but apart from the occasional slip, an accent that hinted she wasn't local, or a fleeting reference to where I used to live, she kept her secrets close. In turn, he didn't press. He recognized that protective shell. When Ethan was younger and asked about the exact details of his mother's passing, Thomas had found himself shutting down, not ready to voice the pain. Perhaps Eliza carried a similar burden. Still, there were moments at dusk, after the shop closed and they gathered in the small apartment for a simple dinner, where the conversation felt almost like a family's. She would ask about Ethan's day, nodding in genuine interest. Ethan would demonstrate whatever mechanical contraption he was building, and Thomas would add fatherly advice. Eliza would share a cooking tip or comment on a local radio show, and it was as though the three of them formed a quiet alliance against the creeping loneliness of their individual lives. Amid this fragile harmony, Trouble loomed on the horizon. Thomas was acutely aware that the next rent payment was due in a week, and he didn't have enough to cover it. He'd negotiated a partial extension, but the landlord made it clear his patience was wearing thin. Late one evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Thomas sat hunched at the kitchen table with a stack of unpaid bills. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion pulling at him. Eliza approached hesitantly, placing a cup of tea by his elbow. He looked up, forcing a tight smile. "Thanks," he said. She nodded, then glanced at the bills, her brow creasing. "You can't do this alone," she whispered. The statement, though quietly delivered, had the force of a firm truth. Thomas didn't respond. He couldn't. He'd been carrying the weight of everything: his grief, his son's future, the shop's survival on his shoulders for so long that the idea of letting someone else in felt both terrifying and impossible. Yet Eliza's presence, her willingness to help, offered a glimmer of relief he hadn't realized he craved. The morning after their late-night exchange, the air crackled with an anticipation Thomas couldn't quite pin down. Eliza was uncharacteristically quiet during breakfast, barely touching the eggs and toast she had helped prepare. Ethan felt the shift too, casting curious glances her way. Thomas, steeling himself for another day of repairs, tried to coax a smile out of her with mild jokes about the old coffee machine spewing sludge, but she only offered a wan grin. Later, at the shop, Ethan was in his element organizing sockets and wrenches by size while Thomas worked on a sedan that needed a new timing chain. Eliza stood nearby, arms folded, eyes distant. She seemed almost restless, as if anticipating someone's arrival. Thomas, engrossed in his work, didn't have time to dwell on it. It was mid-afternoon when the door jangled open and a man stepped inside. He was tall, dressed in a dark wool overcoat that looked far too expensive for Silverton. Thin lines of age creased his face, and he carried himself with an air of authority that made Thomas's hackles rise. Immediately, Eliza stiffened, her face draining of color. The man's hawk-like gaze swept the garage, landing on Eliza with an accusatory stare. "Well, there you are," he said, voice taut with barely restrained anger. Thomas set down his wrench, stepping closer to Eliza. "Something I can help you with?" he asked, maintaining a respectful but firm tone. The man didn't spare him a glance, keeping his focus on her. "You've caused quite a stir," he said to Eliza. "Your father's worried sick." The mention of a father sent a jolt through Thomas. "Father," he looked at Eliza, whose lips quivered as if she might speak, but instead she seemed paralyzed. The man finally turned to Thomas. "Apologies. My name is Garrett Chambers. I'm an associate of the Harrington family. Their daughter, Eloise, is—" He paused, glancing at Eliza. "Well, she's needed back home." Ethan peeked out from behind a tool cart, confusion etched into his young features. Thomas could feel the tension spike in the air, swirling with questions. Harrington family. He'd vaguely recognized the name from headlines about wealthy estate owners in the eastern part of the country. Was Eliza Eloise part of that family? "I don't know what you're talking about," Thomas lied, crossing his arms. It was a gamble. He had only partial information, but his protective instincts flared at this man's demanding tone. Chambers offered a thin smile. "I'd prefer we handle this quietly. The Harrington name doesn't belong in a place like this." He surveyed the dusty shop floor. "No offense, of course." Eliza found her voice, trembling with anger. "I'm not going anywhere with you." Chambers seemed unfazed. "That's not your choice to make, Eloise. Your father is prepared to do whatever is necessary to see you return safely." A heavy silence followed. Thomas glanced at Eliza, who looked on the verge of tears or maybe fury. Then Chambers leaned in, voice dropping. "I'll give you a day. Pack up whatever this man has given you. I expect you at the bus station by tomorrow morning. If you force my hand, it will get ugly." He cast a cold look at Thomas. "For everyone." With that threat, Chambers turned and strode out, leaving a choking tension in his wake. Ethan inched closer, eyes wide. Thomas exhaled, hands shaking. Eliza Eloise stared at the ground. Though she said nothing, the war in her expression spoke volumes. Once Chambers had gone, The shop felt as though someone had ripped the walls away, exposing them to a frigid wind. Eliza Eloise sank onto a stool by the workbench, head bowed, shoulders trembling with a mix of shame and fear. Ethan, unsure what to do, looked to Thomas, who approached her cautiously. The father in him warred with frustration, confusion, and a fierce desire to protect this young woman who had come into their lives unannounced. He crouched to meet her gaze. Eliza, Eloise, which is it? Her eyes flickered, then shut tightly, tears threatening to spill. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't lie to hurt you. Thomas forced patience into his tone. All right, so tell me the truth now. Who are you, really? She swallowed hard, then began speaking in a low, uneven voice. I was born Eloise Harrington. My father is Charles Harrington. And yes, he's wealthy, powerful too. My entire life was planned out private schools, arranged engagements, corporate paths. I felt trapped, so I ran away, thinking if I could just get far enough, I might find something real. She wiped at her face with the back of her hand. I never wanted to involve you or Ethan. She paused, struggling for words. I just needed to be somewhere that didn't expect me to be perfect. Thomas inhaled slowly, letting her confession sink in. So that man, Chambers, works for your father? She nodded, eyes cast downward. He's like my father's right hand, and he's not bluffing when he says it'll get ugly. Ethan, stepping out from behind Thomas, asked, why is it so important for them to make you go back? The child's voice was small but direct. Eloise met his gaze, and some of the tension drained from her expression. Because my father thinks I'm just a rebellious child who doesn't know any better. He set up my marriage to one of his business partner's sons. I'm supposed to cement a corporate alliance. As he puts it, I don't want that. I want, she trailed off, eyes brimming with longing. I want a life that's truly mine. Silence pressed in, thick and stifling. Thomas's mind raced, trying to reconcile the helpful, quiet young woman with the image of a billionaire's daughter living in gilded cages. He glanced around the shop, dusty, cluttered, poor by many standards. Yet it was his and Ethan's. I know what it's like to want to carve your own path, he said finally. But Chambers seemed pretty clear about consequences. Eloise nodded grimly. He'll buy out your landlord, or he'll bribe the local authorities. Whatever it takes to get me back. I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. Thomas exchanged a look with Ethan, who stared up at him with a mixture of worry and hope. Then the father sighed. Maybe we'll find a way to work this out, but we need to do it carefully. He placed a hand on Eloise's shoulder. You said you wanted something real. I don't know if this place counts as much, but it's honest. We fix things here, even if we're barely scraping by. A tremulous smile tugged at her lips. That's more than I had back there. For a moment, no one spoke, each of them grappling with the weight of what lay ahead. The quiet ticking of a rusted clock in the corner seemed to mock them. Time was running out. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. Voice hushed but resolute. We can't let them take you. A child's simple, earnest declaration, yet it resonated with a determined spark in Thomas's chest. No matter how complicated it got, he wasn't going to abandon her now. In the hours that followed Chambers' visit, Eloise's energy shifted from fearful to resolute. She insisted on helping Thomas with every task, from changing oil filters to logging customer payments, as though physically laboring might keep the dread at bay. Thomas noticed how she'd pause every so often, scanning the street outside for any sign of the dark overcoat. The tension in her eyes never completely left, but channeling her anxiety into hard work seemed to provide some temporary relief. Ethan, meanwhile, hovered protectively, darting from the tool bench to the office as if on a secret mission. Whenever Eloise so much as sighed, he'd ask if she needed water or a break. Though it was sweet, Thomas reminded his son to keep a calm front. We don't want to make her feel suffocated, he said gently. Ethan nodded, struggling to balance his eagerness to help with respecting her space. Late afternoon brought a couple of new customers, a small blessing for the shop's finances. A local trucker named Bert needed a tire replaced, and a single mother named Carla came in with a squeaking serpentine belt. Normally, Thomas would have been grateful for the business, but his mind was half occupied by Eloise's predicament. Even as he performed the repairs, he kept glancing at the office door, wondering if Chambers would return unannounced. Eventually, the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky with purples and reds that seeped into the old glass windows of the garage. Thomas locked up, letting out a weary sigh. "Let's head upstairs and figure out dinner," he suggested, voice dull with fatigue. Eloise nodded, following him and Ethan up the stairs. She didn't say much as Thomas flipped on the lights in the apartment, revealing the cramped living room that doubled as a dining area. Ethan grabbed a couple of cans from the cupboard, tomato soup and green beans, and started rummaging for a pot. Thomas set about toasting bread, while Eloise lingered by the window, peering out at the quiet street below. The mild clatter of dishes filled the silence until Thomas cleared his throat. "I know you might not want to talk about it," he said, "but if you're set on not going back, we need a plan." She turned to face him, arms crossed, her expression solemn. "If I don't show up tomorrow," she began, referring to Chambers' ultimatum, "he'll probably escalate. He might threaten you or pay off someone to come after me. It's what my father does. He exerts influence until people cave." Thomas glanced at Ethan, who was chopping up a few leftover carrots like he was on a cooking show, trying to maintain normalcy. "I have to protect my son," he said, voice hushed. "But I don't want to turn you away." Eloise's gaze dropped. "I get it if you can't risk this. You've already done so much." But Thomas noted the tremor in her tone, the hint of desperation. He exhaled, turning off the stove burner as the soup threatened to boil over. "Listen, maybe there's a compromise. We could talk to a lawyer in town, someone who'd help us figure out your options. You're of age, right? 18. Yes, then you should have the legal right to decide where you live," he reasoned. She gave a sad laugh. "My father's lawyers are far more resourceful. They'll spin a story that I'm mentally unstable or being manipulated. I've seen them do worse." Silence settled in the small space. Ethan placed the carrots on the table, glancing between them. Finally, Thomas spoke, setting out 3 bowls for soup. "We'll think of something. We're not alone here." He allowed himself a small smile at Eloise. "You've helped me around the shop, with my bills, even if briefly. It's my turn to return the favor." Eloise pressed her lips together, tears threatening to form. "Thank you," she whispered. Though outside, the cold wind picked up again. Inside the apartment, the warmth of shared determination brought them closer, forging a fragile alliance that transcended their differences in age, background, and social status. Despite their resolve, a persistent undercurrent of tension lingered that night. After dinner, Thomas tried to distract himself by checking on tomorrow's scheduled repairs, while Ethan attempted to show Eloise his latest invention, a miniature windmill fashioned from scrap metal and a small battery pack. She watched with genuine admiration, though her gaze often drifted to the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Eventually, Ethan fell asleep on the couch, and Thomas carried him gently to his bedroom, tucking him in. It was a ritual he rarely performed anymore. Ethan claimed he was old enough not to need tucking in, but Thomas felt the boy needed the extra security tonight. He lingered by the door, watching his son's slow, even breathing, reminded that every choice he made now had to protect this fragile piece. Back in the living room, Eloise stood with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at a framed photograph of Angela that sat on a small shelf. The image showed Angela laughing at the camera, hair swept by the wind on what looked like a family picnic. Eloise spoke softly. "She looked so happy." Thomas's throat tightened. "She was," he admitted, forcing a small smile. "She passed away 4 years ago, illness." He didn't elaborate. The loss still felt fresh sometimes, a wound that refused to fully close. "I'm sorry, Mascoyo," Eloise offered. Silence draped the room like a heavy quilt. Outside, the hush of the night was broken only by the occasional howl of wind. Finally, Eloise sighed. I keep expecting Chambers or someone else to burst in here. I can't rest. Thomas nodded, understanding her fear. We can set a plan. We'll reach out to a lawyer first thing in the morning. I know a guy named Weston who handles small-town disputes. Maybe he can direct us to the right place. If we show you're safe, stable. He trailed off, uncertain but trying to project confidence. Eloise paced a bit. Even if legally I can stay away from my father, he'll find a way to mess up your life, your shop. He might cut a deal with your landlord, force you out. Her voice trembled. I don't want that on my conscience. Thomas pressed his lips into a thin line. The threat was real. He already owed back rent, and if Chambers or Charles Harrington wanted to, they could accelerate the eviction. A swirl of conflicting emotions weighed on him, fear for Ethan, sorrow for Eloise, anger at a system in which wealth bulldozed the powerless. But a stubborn flicker of defiance ignited in his chest. We'll find a way, he said firmly. Faulkner's Repairs has been in my family for decades. I'm not about to let some rich bully tear it down. And I'm not about to hand you over to them just because they have money. She blinked back tears, a hint of relief flickering across her face. I wish I had that kind of courage. Thomas shook his head. You do. You ran away, didn't you? That took guts, but you need to keep pushing, even when it feels like every door is shutting. He reached for a spare blanket, offering it to her. For tonight, get some rest. We'll face tomorrow together. Eloise nodded, though her eyes stayed open long after Thomas retreated to his own room. She lay on the couch, the blanket pulled up to her chin, staring at the ceiling with an expression that mingled resolve and dread. Downstairs, the quiet hum of the empty garage felt like the breath before a storm, and in that stillness, their makeshift family braced for a battle they weren't fully prepared to fight. Morning arrived, accompanied by an early phone call that jolted Thomas from an uneasy sleep. On the line was none other than Weston, the local lawyer Thomas had intended to call himself, breathless and urgent. Weston explained that he'd heard rumors someone was trying to buy out the building, Faulkner's Repairs, occupied rumors pointing to an out-of-town investor with deep pockets. Thomas felt a chill creep into his bones as he listened, glancing over at Eloise, who hovered nearby, eyes wide. He relayed Weston's words after hanging up. They're moving fast, he muttered, raking a hand through his hair. This investor is definitely linked to Harrington. Weston said there's a meeting scheduled in 2 days with the landlord to finalize a deal. Eloise paled, guilt radiating off her. I'll leave, she said quietly, voice trembling. If I go, maybe your shop will be safe. Thomas shot her a sharp look. And what happens to you if you walk out? Now you think they'll just welcome you with open arms and let you live your life. Tears pricked at her eyes. I don't know. Ethan stood by the kitchen table, frowning. We can't just let them win. The boy's stubborn confidence was a heartbreaking reminder of how clear-cut the world could seem through a child's eyes. Good people shouldn't be forced to run. Thomas huffed out a breath. All right, let's not jump to extremes. We have 2 days. I'll see if there's a legal route to block the sale or at least stall it. Eloise pressed her palms together, pacing the length of the room. I can't ask you to do this for me. You're not asking, Thomas countered. We're deciding to stand by you. He paused, then nodded to Ethan. Right, kiddo. Ethan bobbed his head vigorously. Yeah. She looked at them, tears threatening to overflow, and simply nodded. After a quick breakfast, they headed down to the shop, only to find a black luxury car parked outside. Chambers was there, leaning against the vehicle, gloved hands clasped. Thomas felt his stomach twist. Morning, Chambers greeted with a thin smile. I assume Eloise has chosen wisely. His gaze flicked from Thomas to Ethan, lingering in a way that made Thomas's skin crawl, as if he were evaluating them as potential pawns. Thomas stepped forward, placing himself protectively between Chambers and the others. She's not going anywhere with you. Chambers sighed in mock sadness. That's a shame. Mr. Harrington is a man of considerable influence. He's already begun proceedings to acquire this property. You could lose everything if you don't comply. Eloise glared at him. I'm 18. Chambers. Legally, I can make my own choices. My father can't force me to marry anyone if I say no. Chambers' eyes narrowed. You underestimate the family's resources. If you're determined to stay, be prepared to watch Faulkner's repairs become the next abandoned building in this godforsaken town. Thomas fought to keep his voice steady. You'll have a fight on your hands, he stated, even though fear churned inside him. Chambers merely chuckled, pushing off the car and stepping away. 2 days, he reminded them. Enjoy them while you can. As Chambers' car disappeared into the distance, the three stood in tense silence, the winter chill seeping into their bones. Thomas exhaled shakily, turning to Eloise and Ethan with a determined set to his jaw. All right, he said softly. Let's roll up our sleeves and see what we can do. He refused to crumble under Harrington's pressure, and though Eloise's shoulders were tight with dread, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope in the face of Thomas's unyielding resolve. They spent the rest of that day in a flurry of activity, part mechanical, part strategical. Thomas and Ethan tackled as many repair orders as possible, bringing in some much-needed revenue. Meanwhile, Eloise sat at the cramped office desk, poring over legal resources Weston had emailed. She scrolled through small print documents about property rights, tenant protections, and the complexities of big money buyouts. Though her background wasn't legal, her education had given her the ability to parse dense information, and she relayed the key points to Thomas whenever he stepped into the office for a breather. By late afternoon, exhaustion set in. The phone calls with Weston and a couple of local officials had not yielded any definitive solutions. Weston warned that Harrington's team, flush with money, could outmaneuver them in local courts. The best hope, he suggested, was to negotiate directly with the landlord or to prove that forcing out Faulkner's repairs would violate some local Business Preservation Act, though that was shaky at best. As dusk approached, a faint knock sounded at the shop's front door. Thomas, bracing for the worst, opened it cautiously. Instead of Chambers, he found a middle-aged woman bundled in a thick coat. She introduced herself as Martha Green, a local teacher. I heard a rumor your shop might close, she said, glancing past him to see Eloise and Ethan inside. You fixed my car's transmission a few years back. It still runs like a charm. Thought maybe I could help if you need references or a petition from the townsfolk. Thomas was taken aback by the gesture. Martha, he said, voice catching. I appreciate that. Really, I do. He waved her in, and soon they were discussing ways the community might rally to save a staple business like Faulkner's repairs. Martha mentioned posting on social media, getting local families to sign a letter of support, or even contacting the local news. Eloise listened, biting her lip. She realized, with a pang, that these people who barely knew her were willing to fight for something they believed in, partly out of loyalty to Thomas and partly out of respect for the shop's legacy. It stood in stark contrast to her father's world, where everything revolved around personal gain. Martha's eyes flicked to Eloise. And who's this young lady? Eloise hesitated, uncertain what to say, but Thomas stepped in. Her name's Eloise, he explained. Leaving it at that, Martha simply nodded. Nice to meet you, she said kindly, before returning her focus to the petitions. They spent another hour brainstorming until Martha excused herself, promising to spread the word among other locals who owed Faulkner's repairs a debt of gratitude. After she left, Ethan said, I had no idea people liked us that much. Thomas rubbed the back of his neck, feeling a rare humility. Your grandpa used to say that if you do right by folks, they won't forget it. Eloise hovered near the window, hugging her arm. This is incredible, she murmured. A community that actually cares. She glanced at Thomas, her expression a mix of admiration and guilt. I've never seen that before where I come from. Everything is transactional. It's always about the bigger mansion, the bigger check. Thomas offered her a faint smile. Well, Silverton might not have glitz, but it's got heart. He checked his watch. Another day gone. Another day closer to Harrington's takeover attempt. Let's head upstairs, get some supper, and see if we can plan our next move, he suggested. As they closed up, A sense of unity bound them together, a father fiercely protective, a runaway heiress seeking something genuine, and a wide-eyed boy believing in the power of community. Outside, the sky deepened into an inky canvas spangled with stars. Perhaps it was naive optimism, but for the first time since Chambers' ultimatum, they all allowed themselves the smallest hope that perseverance might triumph over power. Supper was a quiet affair in the upstairs apartment. Thomas improvised a stew with canned vegetables, diced beef, and a few spices that Angela once favored. The aroma filled the cramped space, lending a coziness that belied the storm of anxiety beneath. Eloise helped by chopping onions at the small counter, her eyes watering. Though Thomas suspected it wasn't just the onions, Ethan set the table, humming absent-mindedly under his breath, as if trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. Once the food was ready, they gathered around the wobbly table with mismatched chairs. The apartment's single overhead light cast a warm glow on the three of them, almost conjuring an image of a family dinner. Something so simple, yet so precious. They ate quietly at first, the clink of spoons against ceramic bowls standing in for conversation. But the tension was palpable, time was running out, and no miracle solution had materialized. Eventually, Ethan spoke up. I told some friends at school what's happening. They said their parents would sign a petition if we make one. We could get, like, 100 signatures, maybe more. His enthusiasm was a bright spark in the gloom. Thomas nodded, trying to sound encouraging. That might help. At least it shows the community supports the shop. Then he looked to Eloise. But your father's money can steamroll a lot of good intentions. She set her spoon down, expression grim. I've been thinking, maybe I should face him, talk to him directly. Ethan's eyes went wide. But I know, she interjected. It's risky. He might try to force me back. But what if I tell him, to his face, that I'm not returning to that life, no arranged marriage, no controlling my future? Maybe if he hears it from me. She trailed off, uncertainty tinging her voice. Thomas considered this, his jaw clenched. He doesn't strike me as the reasonable type, he said bluntly. And Chambers definitely isn't. Eloise stared at her bowl, swirling the stew absently. I'm out of options. If I vanish again, Harrington will punish anyone who helped me. If I confront him, maybe he'll back off, especially if it goes public. My father hates scandals. Silence followed as they weighed the gamble. Finally, Thomas exhaled. All right, if that's what you really want to do, we'll back you up. But we won't let you go in alone. We do this carefully. A flutter of relief crossed Eloise's face, tempered by apprehension. She looked up, meeting Thomas's gaze. I'm scared, she admitted softly. Thomas reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, giving it a reassuring squeeze. You're not the only one, he said, but we face it together. They spent the rest of the evening mapping out how to contact Charles Harrington. Eloise had a private number stashed in an old phone she'd kept hidden. She'd call him, request a meeting on neutral ground, perhaps a public diner in town where neither side could pull something underhanded without witnesses. Meanwhile, Thomas would speak to Weston and gather the petitions Martha and Ethan were collecting. By the time they'd run through all the scenarios, exhaustion draped their shoulders. They cleared the bowls, and Ethan retreated to his bedroom, casting one last anxious look at Eloise. Thomas offered to sleep on the couch so she could use the bedroom, but she refused, insisting that she was fine. As the night deepened, all three found sleep elusive, each haunted by the realization that tomorrow would bring a confrontation that could end in triumph or tear them apart entirely. Morning dawned with a pale sun struggling to break through a veil of clouds. The air felt thick, heavy with the sense of a final reckoning. Thomas, Eloise, and Ethan ate a hurried breakfast of scrambled eggs, then set their plan into motion. Eloise used her hidden phone to call the private number, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure the men in the room with her could hear it. The voice that answered was clipped, informal, her father's personal assistant, not Chambers. Eloise kept her tone steady, insisting that she speak to Charles directly. After a brief pause, the line clicked. and Charles Harrington's deep baritone cut in, laced with barely concealed anger. "What is this about, Eloise?" he demanded. She swallowed, the urge to hang up surging within her. But she steadied herself. "I want to talk face to face. Today, in Silverton. At Redwood Diner off Highway 5, she said. If you're serious about resolving this, that's where you'll find me." He was silent for a moment, then replied, "Fine. 4 o'clock." The line went dead. Thomas watched her with concern. "We'll be there with you," he assured her. Meanwhile, Ethan hurried off to gather the signatures from his friend's parents, while Thomas phoned Weston to confirm the meeting spot, just in case they needed legal backup. He also told Martha to inform anyone in the community who cared about Faulkner's repairs that the situation was coming to a head. By noon, word had spread like wildfire through the small town. At 3:30, they drove to Redwood Diner in Thomas's old pickup, its engine rattling ominously. Eloise sat in the passenger seat, fidgeting with the silver bracelet on her wrist. Ethan was squeezed into the middle seat, awkwardly holding a folder of signatures and letters from locals who supported Thomas. The tension was thick enough to taste. Arriving at the diner, they parked beside a line of rusted trucks and modest sedans. Just as they stepped onto the curb, a sleek black car rolled in. Out stepped Charles Harrington, flanked by Chambers. Charles was tall, silver-haired, exuding an air of authority that turned heads among the scattering of diners peering from windows. He locked eyes with Eloise, lips set in a thin line, then shifted his gaze to Thomas. The group moved inside, settling into a booth by the window. The diner's hum of conversation quieted, customers curious about this unlikely gathering. Charles wasted no time. "Eloise, enough. Come home. You've had your fun playing runaway. Now let's be adults." Eloise clenched her jaw. "I'm not playing at anything. I'm living on my own terms. I'm not returning for an arranged marriage or to be paraded around for your business deals." Charles's nostrils flared. Chambers leaned forward, about to interject, but Thomas spoke first. "This is Silverton, Mr. Harrington. We might not have much, but we stand by each other." He produced the folder from Ethan. "This is a list of local families who rely on my shop and who don't appreciate your attempts to drive us out. If you go through with purchasing the property, you'll face a public backlash, maybe even national coverage." Eloise seized the moment. "If you care about your precious reputation, you'll respect my decision. I'm staying with the Faulkners until I can stand on my own feet." She paused, voice trembling but unbroken. "I'm not a child, Father." "I won't be your pawn," Charles glowered, gaze flicking to Chambers, who looked slightly taken aback by the show of solidarity in the diner. A few patrons even stood, crossing their arms as if to show support for Thomas and Eloise. The silence stretched, a taut wire threatening to snap. Finally, Charles exhaled in frustration. "Fine," he spat. "You want to throw away your inheritance for this? This hovel, be my guest. But you're on your own." Eloise felt tears burn her eyes but held them back. She nodded, lifting her chin. "That's all I ever asked." Without further argument, Charles turned and strode out, leaving Chambers scrambling to keep up. Once they were gone, the diner erupted in murmurs. Eloise sank back, chest heaving with a mix of relief and heartbreak. Thomas placed a hand on her shoulder. Ethan hopped up, grins stretching ear to ear. "They're gone," he exclaimed. But Eloise stared after her father's retreating form, absorbing the finality of his words. She had severed ties, at least for now, and the cost was higher than money. It was family. Yet as the townspeople offered quiet nods of approval and the waitress poured fresh coffee, Eloise realized she wasn't alone. She had made her choice, stepping into an uncertain world, but carrying the assurance of genuine support. Thomas, Ethan, and Silverton at large had her back. Maybe that was what real wealth felt like, having a place to belong. A life that was finally her own. There are moments that define who we are not by the ease of the choice, but by the courage it takes to stand firm when everything around us crumbles. In the end, this wasn't a story about power or wealth, but about people who chose each other in a world that often demands isolation. It was about a father determined to protect what little he had left, a young woman brave enough to rewrite her story, and a boy whose innocent faith reminded them both what was truly worth fighting for. What was gained wasn't riches or victory in any traditional sense, but something quieter, deeper, a sense of belonging that no threat could dismantle. Yet it wasn't without cottonmouths were severed, families divided, and scars left behind that would never fully heal. Choices have consequences. Bravery, too, carries its own weight. Now, as the cold recedes and sunlight returns to Silverton, the small shop on the edge of town stands not as a monument to defiance, but as a simple testament to resilience, compassion, and the unbreakable strength of community. Perhaps, in the quiet after the storm, we might pause and wonder when faced with impossible odds and choices that test the very fabric of who we are. Would we have the courage to stand firm, too? And if we did, would it be enough to build something lasting from the rubble left behind?